What else do you think open source might be able to solve? And I've had some reasonably direct experience with watching, I suppose, one example of what you described, which is Automatic. And very good friend, Matt Mullenweg, I'm an advisor to Automatic. And for those who don't know, Matt, who's been on the show multiple times, was a lead developer of WordPress, very familiar with open source, and then has built a sort of services and enterprise grade, secure, stable solution for many different businesses and people in the form of Automatic. So I'm deeply interested in this, and I know you are as well. You're a big fan of open source. What else do you think open source could be applied to or might be applied to?
First of all, I think people are relatively familiar with the big individual software projects, Linux being the most well-known. It's over 20 years old now. It's clearly the most used operating system in the world. And what people might not know about it is a lot of scientists believe it's the most secure. And that's kind of counterintuitive. Oh, all the code's public. How could it be the most secure? But it gets beat up the most, because it's used the most. There's a great piece of writing, an incredible piece of writing called The Cathedral and the Bazaar that was the first kind of magnum opus on why this open source thing might work. And another thing people don't get is the Cathedral and the Bazaar compared, are you trying to build up like the Gaudi church or a bazaar, which is super flat and wide and obviously built by lots of people. And the thing is, like, open source is way better at complex problems than simple problems. And it's the very complex problems that would be hard for a single company to do. And so if you're building an operating system, it might have all kind of edges on how it integrates with other systems, different drivers you might need. And the world is able to build that, whereas an individual company would be very difficult. And so we started to see that in MySQL, and there have been others like MongoDB, and we're in one called Elastic. And there's been a lot of successful companies around single software frameworks. Something started happening about 10 to 15 years ago, which is people started using open source in more complex ways, and sometimes using it defensively rather than offensively. So the most well-known is probably Android, right? So Apple had come out with this smartphone. You could only get it on AT&T. It scared the shit out of everybody, not just Google, but it scared the shit out of all the other telcos. It scared the shit out of all the other handset manufacturers. And so Google did this clever thing. They said, oh, we're going to create a competitor, but it's going to be open source so you can trust us. Now, there's different versions of how open something is, and Android's not very open. But at the time, compared to the threat of Apple, it seemed like a much better trade. And so they got the world behind them on this thing. Yeah. And it took off. Since then, that model's been repeated in some esoteric ways. Facebook has something called the Open Compute Project. And if you want your hardware to go into the Facebook data server room, it has to be compatible with their open source framework. And what that means is no one can have an IP claim against Facebook because you've basically sworn off your IP. So they're commoditizing the stuff they're going to purchase. Since then, AT&T and China Mobile have worked with the Linux Foundation to do the same thing for the wireless and wireline equipment stack. So they're defining open standards for their next gen products. And if you're a supplier that wants to sell to them, you have to agree to those standards. And once again, you're out of the IP game, so they don't get held up. It's very clever stuff.
Would you mind expanding on that a little bit? The IP piece?
Well, let's go to the Facebook one because it's more understandable. It's called the Open Compute Foundation. It's managed by the Linux Foundation acts as a steward, much in the way that the crypto world thinks a DAO manages this loose federation. The Linux Foundation does that. Linux has been a DAO for 25 years. It's super interesting. And so that group helps. They're like a nonprofit overseer of the project, break ties.
Yep.
They do patent defense, which I think is super interesting. So they pool patents and no one sues within the open source project. But if someone were to come attack it, you'd go out after them. So anyway, Facebook has all these equipment in their data center, networking equipment, storage equipment, computers, software. So they just created this thing called the Open Compute Foundation that defines open standards for how all these products work. And so if you want to be on their purchasing list, you say, yes, we are compatible with this open standard. And once again, it basically commoditizes that equipment.
So it just gives Facebook more leverage with a broader spectrum of suppliers.
Every one of these things has a website and you can go see. And so now, Amazon and Google, they're all part of Open Compute, right?
If I'm understanding you correctly, tell me if I'm missing something. They're trying to create conditions such that they wouldn't end up, back in the day when I moved to Silicon Valley, I worked in storage area networking. And EMC at the time was pretty famous for kind of being a black box. Like if anything broke, if anything went wrong, like you needed EMC to fix it or upgrade it. And so to avoid being held hostage or losing leverage with suppliers, Facebook made this move. Is that a fair description?
Absolutely. And then another high profile one.
That's genius. I mean, it's very smart.
Oh, it's super clever. Google was very afraid of Amazon running away with the cloud services business in AWS. And so they had a piece of technology called Kubernetes. And this was right around when Docker and containerization took off. And Kubernetes was an orchestration layer for containers. And Google decided...
What a bizarre name. What was it? Kubernetes? Sounds like an Italian pasta.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, though. They decided that it was in their best interest to take this technology and gift it to an open source consortium. They got the Linux Foundation to manage it. And they went out and recruited IBM and HP and all these other vendors to say, oh, yeah, we'll support Kubernetes, because everyone wanted to make sure that people weren't locked into Amazon. And eventually it got so successful that Amazon had to announce support for Kubernetes. And now if you need to move a workload from Google to Amazon, there's a common framework for which to do that. And so you're less locked in.
So this seems like it's become, at least based on the examples you gave, like a very refined, reliable counterpunch that Google uses.
I call it defensive corporate strategy.
Yeah.
And I'll give you two more very recently. Well, there's always been OpenStreetMaps, and that's kind of interesting because it's data rather than, but the OpenStreetMaps team was very kind of non-commercial. So they didn't like when Apple and Google's obviously running away with the maps business. So if you just look this up, like within the past 4 weeks, there's a new open source map group that's going to live on top of OpenStreetMaps that has Facebook and Microsoft and, the other parties that don't want Google to run away with it. And quite frankly, I think that's pretty cool. If you talk to, actually, someone you should have on, if I think that would be really cool, is Jim Zimlin, who's run the Linux Foundation for this whole time.
Oh,
because
good idea.
He's a huge believer, and this kind of ties into Matt Ridley's ideas having sex, that not having IP is actually great for the world, right? Because it just creates constraints for people being able to take advantage of things. And so... mapping's super interesting to me because it's data oriented. There's something called RISC-V, which is an open source processor, believe it or not, that has a lot of momentum now. You'll see people on the earnings calls for ARM. They'll start, is this a competitor? Is this going to be a problem? Because it's completely free license, and China is a big backer of open source, and you could understand why, because the West has accused them of IP theft. So this is a world where you can't be accused.
It's a safe space.
Yeah, so they're investing like crazy. But I wonder what's possible. I'll give you some kind of grander ideas. First of all, I think autonomous vehicles should definitely be open source. I think everyone benefits. Safety's higher. Communication layers are better. Like the idea that you would use artificial intelligence to figure out whether a light is red, yellow, or green is really fucking stupid, because it's a state machine. It is in one of those three states, and that could be communicated into the software. Like you don't need to infer that. That's a known thing, but you need a common language. Your test suites could all be used by everyone. Academia could be working on the same thing that the corporations are. Safety's higher, easier for government to get involved if it's a single standard. And I wonder about other things, like the NIH gives out $40 billion a year, and many of these projects end up as, research that leads to a drug that leads to having a 17-year patent life and gets sold at $300,000 a year or whatever. Why wouldn't we say, if you take NIH dollars, your research is open source? Why do we use government dollars to fund stuff that becomes proprietary? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. This is something that you and I can have a conversation about separately. Yeah, I
look at the state of nuclear energy, where the costs are high because of regulation, not because of the actual product. And I wonder, what if the globe had a standard for fission-based nuclear reactor? Like, wouldn't we get to lower price points? Wouldn't we get to safer products? Wouldn't they get more evolved? It seems possible to me.